There we go. Thank you. All right. So hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett, and I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's QUASI seminar. These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, teachers, and practitioners, we know that too many studies focus on questions that only rehash and rename established ideas, and it may have no practical impact. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, are corporate win-win strategies an effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems? Answering in the affirmative and sharing the value of shared value with us, we have Mark Kramer. Countering in the negative, it's Andy King. Clarifying the contingencies, she's the coolest Canadian co-author a Yankee could ever ask for, Irene Henriques. And finally, bringing a practical perspective to this important topic, it's Auden Schendler. As each of our presenters argue their positions, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. The open discussion will occur after all four of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that will remain thereafter. So let's go ahead and get the party started, and we'll go over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here with everyone. I'm going to share my screen, I think. Hopefully people can see it. And so my job is to be the pro argument that corporate win-win strategies are an effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems. I confess I'm going to come down very strongly on this one preposition "and," which may slightly undercut some of the argument and rebuttal from others, because I certainly don't want to suggest that it is the only effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems, nor do I want to suggest that win-win strategies alone are a sufficient effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems. But I do believe, and I have to say I've been working in this space for more than a decade, and every year I am convinced more strongly that certainly win-win strategies are a necessary and effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems. So let me go down. You know, our beginning point of view, which was expressed in the article 10 years ago on creating shared value, is that for all we talk about the tension and conflict between social, environmental objectives and business profitability, there is a really much stronger interdependence between the two. So, you know, companies can't be successful. We've seen this with COVID, without a healthy workforce, without a consumer base of people who are earning an adequate living to be able to buy products, et cetera, without the sustainable use of natural resources, without a strong economy. I think COVID has actually been a very interesting example of how business cannot survive without government support and without government subsidy and setting the conditions for competition. And we couldn't have cured or have had the advances we've had in vaccines for COVID without, of course, the active engagement of the private sector and without the active engagement of the nonprofit sector. So to my mind, COVID has really reinforced the lesson that I've come to, that it is the combination of sectors working together, which I will acknowledge they very rarely do, that is really what it takes to create lasting solutions to social problems at scale. But I'll also say that business has a distinctly different role when it comes to solving social problems than either government or NGOs. You know, first of all, without a successful economy, there are no wages, there are no tax revenues, there is no wealth to support philanthropy. So I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that you really cannot create a just and fair society, an adequate standard of living for people, without a strong competitive economic base. The second thing, though, is that companies really act differently than NGOs and government in some important ways. First, they have an extraordinary incentive to take risk and to try new things that have never been done before, that government typically will not do and that NGOs typically do not have the capacity to do. Second of all, the competition that business faces fuels constant pressure for innovation, efficiency, and to ensure that whatever they come up with is actually adopted and used in practice. I have to say I've spent many, many years working with leading charitable foundations, and I've seen many, many wonderful charitable ideas that just don't work in practice because it turns out people don't actually want them. If you're in business selling a product that happens to be helpful to society or the environment, you're not in business long unless people actually buy it and use it. And so that pressure on adoption of innovation, I think, is tremendously important and quite unique to business. And lastly, of course, I would readily admit that we cannot solve every social problem through a market-driven model. But where we can, we have access to capital markets that can scale up solutions hugely. And of course, they can be sustained indefinitely without worrying about raising charitable dollars or tax revenues. So I've come to believe that we cannot effectively tackle social and environmental problems without engaging business. You know, I attached the article that I'm sure many of you read a decade ago on creating shared value. We've actually done a lot of work advancing that since. There are now about 24 HBS teaching cases on shared value and purpose and stakeholder capitalism that Mike Porter and I have written and now teach a course on it and so on. But that original article talked about sort of 3 different levels at which business can create shared value, engage with society in ways that create a competitive advantage for the business, that improves the business's performance, and also creates meaningful social and environmental progress. The first is around new products and new markets. The second is around rethinking productivity in the value chain. And the third is around improving the local business environment. So let me just give you a couple examples of each. I think we all are very conscious of the impending pressures and, frankly, doomsday scenario of climate change. And while electric vehicles are not in themselves a sufficient solution to carbon emissions, they are one necessary element. So could we imagine electric vehicles having taken off without Tesla? You know, it's interesting to note in the 1980s, every major car company had a research and development investment in trying and building electric cars. And by the 1990s, when Tesla was beginning, they had all completely abandoned that market. No one was doing anything on it. And of course, it took Musk $1 billion investment before the IPO to actually begin to produce the cars. So, and the impact is not, of course, just that Tesla has sold a few 100,000 cars. The impact is that every major car company in the world is now moving toward electric vehicles with tremendous innovation. Could this have happened without venture capital investment and the private sector? I don't think so. Government programs to promote electric cars, we've had tax credits for a long time, didn't do much. An NGO that had been successful at marketing and creating electric cars as a social enterprise could never have gotten $1 billion in capital and achieved the kind of scale and impact that Tesla has. So again, it's not a complete solution, but without the investment capital, the innovation, the competitive opportunity and mandate that the private sector brings, I don't think we would be on a path to an electric vehicle future. Thinking about improving productivity in the value chain. You know, one of the interesting things we're seeing is a sort of paradox. We've always assumed that if you pay your employees more, you'll have less profit. The reality we're seeing, and there's some wonderful work being done by Zain Upton at MIT with the Good Jobs Institute, is that when you actually pay people good wages, living wages with healthcare and benefits, and an opportunity for advancement and a degree of autonomy in how they do their job, they perform much, much better. And again, it's not surprising when you think about it, that people who are scrambling to survive on minimum wage, often working more than one job, absolutely unable to handle any financial catastrophe, any sickness of themselves or a family member and continue to work, that removing those extraordinary stresses is going to give you a more productive workforce with lower turnover cost. And there's some really interesting examples. Mod Pizza is a rapidly growing fast food pizza joint that was created specifically to create employment for people who did not have access to good employment. And they've developed a program to hire at-risk youth, unemployed youth who do not have high school degrees, and actually youth who've been involved in the criminal justice system, working with the Department of Corrections to actually hire youth who are being returned to society from incarceration. Dave's Killer Bread, a very successful bread product that personally I enjoy greatly, has also focused on second chance employment, hiring people who have come out of prison who would otherwise have difficulty obtaining jobs. I will never forget the head of HR at Dave's Killer Bread, talking about the first interview she did with someone who had been in prison. And the interview started off saying, so, how did you end up in prison? And the answer was, well, I killed someone. It's sort of hard to think about how the HR interview goes on from there. And yet they hired that person. And again, they found a highly productive workforce, very low turnover. Managed by Q is an interesting story. It was a very successful janitorial startup that said, if we paid people good wages with benefits, with retirement plans, with opportunity for promotion, we could hire much more productive people to be janitors, but we also are going to hire people with high emotional intelligence. We actually test for that in the hiring. So they actually begin to build relationships with the office employees who are often there at the end of the day when the janitors come in. And the result has been a much more profitable janitorial business, very successful. I have to admit there's a footnote to that example, which was that they were sold after just a few years for $200 million to WeWork. And WeWork completely trashed the model. And I'm sorry to say that Managed by Q has laid off a lot of people. It has been sold again from WeWork, and that wonderful vision and competitive advantage that they started with is no longer there. When we think about the third level of shared value, we think about the community, the economic cluster in which the industry is operating. And of course, the success of a company depends not just on what you're doing within the company, but on the environment in which, the competitive context environment in which you're operating. And one of the cases I teach in my course is about Yara, which is a Norwegian fertilizer company, and the agricultural cluster they created in Tanzania. They wanted to sell fertilizer to smallholder farmers in Tanzania, but there were all kinds of problems. I mean, the farmers were in poverty. There was no access to financing to buy the fertilizer. There were no good roads to get fertilizer out to the farmers or to get crops back to the port. The port itself was very corrupt. It took 150 days to get something through the port, which made it impossible to deliver fertilizer on time or to sell perishable products. So what Yara did is actually bring together almost 70 other entities, other companies operating the region, both local and multinational, Ministry of Agriculture from the government, the Rockefeller and Gates Foundations, the World Bank, et cetera, and put together a comprehensive $3 billion plan to create a successful agricultural cluster. And that meant providing electricity, providing irrigation, providing roads, providing training for farmers, teaching them which crops they could sell, fixing the problems and corruption at the port, and on and on. And it has been highly effective in lifting 2 million smallhold farmers out of poverty. And of course, this is a region where countless nonprofits have been involved. Africa gets $40 billion a year of international aid. But what we saw is that the nonprofits were each tackling one problem. One might train farmers, one might provide financing for agricultural inputs. But without all of the problems being solved together, no one piece was actually able to succeed. And it took a company that understood the business model and the business necessities to work with other companies and government to identify what are the necessary attributes for this entire cluster to become successful, and then to catalyze the change that needed to happen. Mike, I know I'm almost out of time. I'm going to very quickly just mention we're seeing more and more examples around the world of companies coming in and actually changing issues at a community or state or national or country level, because they're finding it worthwhile to invest in helping to fix the healthcare system, helping to overcome environmental issues, helping to train workers in order for them to be able to enter markets that they used to think of as a market failure, but turn out can be quite successful. So I'm supposed to leave you with a research challenge. And let me take a minute to explain this. There's a lot of excellent work being done on monetizing social and environmental impacts. My colleague at Harvard, George Serafin, has been leading this impact-weighted accounts initiative, which has done an absolutely stunning job of looking at different industries and monetizing the key social and environmental impacts of that industry, and then being able to compare companies in an industry and say, you know, this credit card company is making a nice profit, but when you take into account the social costs, it is actually costing society much more than its bottom line. This other competitor is actually delivering value to society beyond its profit. That's wonderful. My concern with that, though, is that these are fictional dollars. These are not dollars that I believe the investment community is really going to pay attention to, because even though we've monetized it, this is not money that shows up in the bank account of the company. So I think there is a necessary complement to monetizing impact, and that is to create hybrid metrics that link social environmental performance to key financial metrics, not trying to monetize them, but link them. One real quick example, we worked with an Italian utility, Enel, which now operates electric utilities in about 130 countries. And they have been moving rapidly toward decarbonizing, toward using renewable energy. And when you look at the industry, you can find out which utilities are profitable and which utilities are decarbonizing most rapidly. But you cannot identify who is most profitably decarbonizing. And so we've suggested that Enel can actually look at the gross power margin relative to its carbon intensity. And they're finding that actually renewable energy is more profitable to them than fossil fuel-based power generation. And so we can come up with an equation that links the carbon intensity of profit for utilities and compare that across industry. We can do the same thing with the health impact of pharmaceutical companies, with the nutritional value of food companies, with the waste involved in industrial production. In any given industry, we can find one or two of the most material social and environmental impacts that have a causal connection to the financial performance of companies in that industry. And I believe that creating these combined metrics are actually going to be a necessary component enabling us to figure out who is having the most positive social and environmental impact in the most profitable way. So that's the research challenge I would put out. And I will stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. And that, you know, sets up a lot for Irene as well, I think, in terms of the metrics. It's something we've co-authored on. But for now, we turn it over to Andy.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, I want to thank Mike for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's an honor to be on a panel with Mark and Irene and Auden. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say. Second of all, I totally agree with Mark that the business has to be engaged in our world's problems. And I'm not going to debate that question. I'm going to debate this issue of whether win-win strategies are an effective way of alleviating social and environmental problems. And I'm going to admit that when I started working on this, I struggled because I wasn't sure what a win-win strategy was. And what Mark just so eloquently demonstrated is the basic working of the free market often delivers benefit. In fact, that goes all the way back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith argued that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker that we get our evening meal. It's from their regard to their self-interest. And it's the notion that self-interest drives business to do all kinds of things in a very focused way that deliver all kinds of amazing benefits. He mentioned Tesla. Tesla, of course, much funded for a period of time there for the first few years with billions of dollars by credits from government. But nonetheless, the pursuit of profit is now delivering us electric vehicles, and other companies are following. And we see those things as amazing. But this is a long history. I mean, think about trains and telephones and sulfa drugs and fuel injected engines and burritos and solar and wind and nuclear power. All those things deliver win-win benefit. And so when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, what then is a win-win strategy? And, you know, I know that we have these other cases, which, and Mark mentioned at the end, market fails, where the pursuit of profit actually has spillover harm. And those are the things that we think of as causing our social and environmental problems. Those are climate change and plastic waste and habitat destruction and all those kinds of things. So where in this is win-win? I mean, the top, if it's win-win is that the top and that's shared value, that's trivial. That's Adam Smith. If it's the bottom, it seems impossible. And then I read a very interesting comment from Mark Kramer, where in a recent paper where he said, classical economics taught business leaders that social and environmental issues were externalities that had no effect on the business. But the evidence all around us shows that this is wrong. Today, most successful companies have learned that social impact of their business is a critical factor in their competitive strategy and operational effectiveness. And so that gave me a little bit of a hook. So I started realizing, okay, what's really going on here is win-win strategies are these things that take where we think there's no link, but we into one where the market works, where market fails, and into ones where market works. And there are strategies for doing that. And when you read a lot of the people who've written on this, sometimes those strategies are very simple. It's just getting people to realize that the opportunity exists. And they often tell a story that some of us have heard about the blindness we can have about how we've already discovered what we can discover. And that's the story of an economist walking down the street. He sees a $20 bill on the sidewalk. And he says, I won't bother picking it up because if it was real, it wouldn't be there. The notion that there are no opportunities that have not been discovered. And sometimes getting people to see these win-win opportunities is as simply as telling them, no, they're real. So that win-win is converting these things where the market fails into where the market works. Okay, great. Well, that's great. And I'm taking the position of no today. And win-win successes, I'm going to argue, are an exception, not a rule. And the false hope in these can cause a lot of damage. So why are they exceptions, not the rule, given we have all these cases? Well, the first part of that is cases can be really misleading. And then I'm going to talk about the quantitative evidence. So I have to admit that this took me years to realize that cases can be misleading. And here's my story. Early in the 90s, I was doing work on innovation, and I found a bunch of innovations in factories in the Boston area, and they were good for the public and they were good for profits. And I thought that was, wow, this is really cool. There are win-win strategies out there. And I wrote this up, and thought leaders came along. Several people wrote, not just my research, lots of people were doing this kind of work at the time, and they basically extrapolate. Based on these cases, they predict there are abundant opportunities for profiting by providing these public goods. Well, that's wonderful. And for years, I thought, wow, that's fantastic. But then as I got older and my hair grayed and I began to settle into my lower extremities, I began to say, wait a minute here. Maybe we're just seeing the ones that work, and the ones where they try to provide public goods, not profitable, they fail, and we don't see those. So we get a selection. And I said, wait, aren't we sure? And the answer to that is no. There are many of these. There are many of these opportunities out there. And there's so many that they're going to have this, we're debating today, this big impact. And if you go back, that's the argument that was made by many leading thought leaders. Amory Lovins is a classic. Amory Lovins argued for years that there were all these energy efficiency opportunities out there, claimed it was not only a free lunch, it was a lunch you were paid to eat, and we could solve climate change for fun and profit as a result. These things were so abundant. We could cut the US energy bill in half, pay for itself in 6 months, those kinds of claims. And in the 90s, and I suggested people read this, an article by Paul Joskow says, well, yeah, but you may be just looking at cases. What about the overall distribution of these things? And they engaged in a very entertaining back and forth. And recently, a very well-done paper in JPE shows that even well-designed efficiency programs are so costly that they're really turn out to be a lose-lose. They cost people money and they actually don't advance human welfare. What about social responsibility? Well, same thing. Early in the 90s, I found these examples of firms doing these, providing public goods and making money. But then over time, lots of quantitative research. I saw Sandra Waddick on the line, people going back and forth on whether there's a relationship. Just a recent paper here by Zhao and Merrill, showing that doing good is not connected with doing well, and doing well is not connected with doing good. Now, you could say, wait a minute, and this is where Mark Kramer ended at the end. You're not thinking about which aspects of that is material. There are parts of that where you could do these provide these social goods, and it would be profitable. And if we think about that, that's going to be profitable. And so note that they admit, okay, so we don't have this overall relationship, but maybe there's a relationship between some parts of it. So despite countless studies, there have never been conclusive evidence that social responsible investing delivered alpha. And the reason is this lack of thinking strategically about the link. And they point to a paper by Kahn, Serafine, and Yoon, where they look at the material things a firm might do and then its profits. And that paper finds this very, very strong effect, 3 to 6% additional return per year, alpha, your stock performs that much better. Well, it turns out, unfortunately, that result is a statistical artifact, as people say. Their measure there is conflated with sector, particularly with the extractive industry sector in the thousands. When you put in better controls for sector than they do to take that effect, it goes away. When you run reasonable models, other reasonable models, you find that their result is very much an outlier. Here's 448 additional models you could run, different controls, different functional forms. And what you find is their result, the reported result, is in the top 2%. So that's a statistical artifact. And so what could we know? Well, cases, they exist, but they're misleading. And the quantitative evidence says, at best, limited economic importance. So now let's turn about, well, why is this bad? Because, you could just keep trying, and why not, right? Just keep trying to provide public goods through the profit motive. Well, one reason is it creates harm and waste. The other one is it delays regulation. And the waste story I love, and this is a story, so I've picked this, is, after the Haitian earthquake, when there was tremendous devastation in housing, you could respond. How would you respond? Well, you could go in and you could build houses. But some people said, no, we're going to come up with a better way. We're going to crowdsource designs for houses that are going to be, novel houses, and they're going to be so cheap, they're going to cost $300. And they created this win-win project. And it was launched in the Harvard Business Review. It was heavily supported by Jim Kim, who was the president of Dartmouth at that time. Anyone raised questions was told they had fractured souls. The argument was made that there's no such, away with you skeptics, there's no such thing as false hope, there's only hope. It was win-win for the sponsors. They won awards, they went on to, better jobs, but no novel design came out of it. No houses were ever built. So it turned out to be just a waste of money. It was a lose-lose. Now you could say I cherry picked that, and I did. But when you listen to people like Eric Samanas, who was one of the proponents of the base of the pyramid and worked on it for many years, he arguments that just trying to do multiple things, trying to do a win-win, actually creates bad businesses. And a lot of times you just have to go back to Adam Smith. Forget about win-win, just focus on survival. And there are going to be others, and there's Auden Schendler. He, I'm sure, will mention the difficulties of implementing what he'd learned from Amory Lovins. He'd worked for Amory Lovins. So others share that disappointment. So, well, that's fine, disappointing, but what's the real problem? Well, the real problem is this hope is often used to delay regulation. And I don't have to tell this community, because many people on here are from ARCS or from ONE, and many people have studied these examples where firms respond to concerns about social and environmental performance by claiming they're going to fix it without government regulation. I studied responsible care. Jorge Rivera Fizan studied sustainable slopes. People studied equator principles. We know all these cases where firms say, you know, don't regulate, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to do it for profit by ourselves. And there's a really interesting article, which I also recommended, by David Posen, who is the dean now at the Columbia, associate dean at Columbia Law School, where he goes back and shows the right has used the hope in these win-wins created by transparency and reporting as a means of forestalling regulation for 100 years. It started as a leftist idea, but then transformed into a rightist idea. And you can say, well, that's transparency and that's 100 years ago. Well, what about more recent? Well, there's an incredible paper coming from Anki Bergquist and Thomas David, where they go back into the 1970s and they show in the 1970s, astonishingly, people were already worried about planetary boundaries, already worried about these limits. And Morris Strong and the International Chamber of Commerce explicitly used a strategy of pushing hope and win-win as a way of forestalling government regulation. And you can say, okay, but that's the 70s, it's 50 years ago. But here's Larry Fink. Larry Fink in 2018-19 got all this credit for coming out and saying, you know, we're going to deliver positive contributions to society, and that's going to lead to financial performance. And there's this new vision for corporations. It sounded marvelous. But now we see the strategy coming into focus a little better. You know, in January of 2021, Larry Fink is a warning against the potential shortfalls of government regulation of the climate. And we don't need government regulation. We're going to see vast changes in the public arena. We're not going to need governmental change or regulatory change. So my argument, are corporate win-win strategies an effective way of leading social and environmental problems? Well, for those, Adam Smith way, sure. But if we're going to try to fix the externalities, all those things that create the social and environmental problems, it's very difficult. Win-win successes there are the exception, not the rule. And the false hope in being able to do that leads to damage. So really, I can say what I want to say in my whole presentation here in 2 slides. This is my fear. We look at rising climate problems, habitat destruction, and so forth, and we think, oh, gee, I wonder when win-win strategies will kick in and save us. When what we really should be doing, and this I think is the role of thought leaders, and this would be my challenge, and comparable to Mark's challenge at the end there, what we really need is thought leaders to be getting us out there and advocating and pushing for governmental regulation. So what do we want? Carbon tax. When do we want it? Now. Thank you guys very much.
All right, thank you very much, Andy. So I think we can clearly state now that win-win opportunities do exist, but the question is, are they more unicorn or are they commonplace? So it's a question of when do they exist and when do they not? So we'll turn it over for contingencies discussion here to Irene.
Do you see my big screen? Yes, thank you so much. That picture is a beautiful, what is it? It's, believe it or not, let me get that here. It's my flower. It's a flower I have in my garden. So just to let everyone know that I actually have a very small green thumb. It sort of looks at this idea that it's all spread out. So it really does depend insofar. That's my argument, it depends. Now, why does it depend? And I think I heard from Mark and I heard from Andy, and you brought up wonderful, and you're absolutely, both of you are right in your statements. And one of the reasons it depends is because it depends on the type of problem we have. We can have tame environmental or social problems, or you can have wicked environmental social problems. And what's really fascinating, and this is one thing that I want to sort of Albert Einstein once said, if I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute solving it. And that's the crux of it depends on this stuff. If the problem is tame There's a clear definition. Outcomes are defined and determinate. Problems are associated with low uncertainty. Shared values on desirability of the outcomes. Problem largely unchanging across time. Problem usually confined to specific areas. And these could be point pollution, things like food contamination. Once they know where it is and the sources, it can be dealt with and it can be solved. Usually they're also handled by a limited number of actors. That's easy. And yes, firms are excellent at doing that. Now, sometimes they have to be regulated to do that because there's some cost, but usually they could see the low-hanging fruit stuff and they see it and they do it. Now, when you have wicked problems, whether social or environmental, then there's disagreement as to the definition of the problem. There's no single outcome. Assessment whether things are going to be better or worse. The solutions are based on judgment of multiple actors. This problem is associated with high uncertainty as to the system. Look what's going on with COVID. We have all these people being their own doctors, right? Defining what is going on. This should never have actually happened. But this is a wicked problem. And so then there's a problem also changes across time, new variants. There's a problem that's not confined to a specific area or region. And so there's a public problem amongst host of actors. This requires co-creation. You need to bring people together. How do we communicate better? How do we deal with this? How do we can work together to solve this issue? I'll give you an example. Did you know that the motor car was viewed as a solution to the environmental issue caused by horse-drawn carriages? And you know what that caused the problem was? Yes, I will say it, dung, right? It used to pollute, it was very unhealthy to live in cities. Cities were filthy, unhealthy, dangerous. So they had to find solutions. And one of the solutions was, of course, the electric tram, the bicycle, horseless carriage, which is the predecessor for the car. And then also they tried to build parks, the engine, the lungs of the city. So they did all these things. But they needed to figure out what the problem was. Unfortunately, the car sort of won the game. There's a whole history about the car. You should read it. It's really fascinating how the engine surpassed the electric car in the 1920s because the electric car was everywhere, and all of a sudden they used marketing to show that it's a big, stronger vehicle. And electric cars are only for women. I don't understand. But anyway, there was a huge history about that. It was fascinating. So we need to understand that we have to think more about the problem. In defining it, understanding it, bringing people together is really critically important. And so in this case, climate change, income inequality, biodiversity are examples of that. So it depends on the problem. It also depends on the type and the amount of pressure that firms get insofar as dealing with the problem. You have threat of action coming from stakeholders, and you have threat of action coming from also from government. And I think it's critically important that we don't put government in the same level as other stakeholders. They're not. All right. As Andy said, they have the ability to do things. If we ask them to do, they will do it. And so in the case where there's low threat of action from stakeholders, low threat of actions from government, you have this, what we call carefree. And this is managing for shareholders, and they do what they want and everything's fine. In the next case, we have a lot of threat from stakeholders, but very little from government. You have the calculation, which we could call calculation, where you're managing for stakeholders. So the firm's getting this pressure, and they look at determine, well, what's the win-win for us? How do we increase our legitimacy with these stakeholders? Are they important? So this Mitchell, Agel, Wood, the argument comes from there, and we start thinking about our stakeholders more. In the case where you have a threat from government, but very little threat from stakeholders, then you're managing for the industry. The Bhopal example, where you have the responsible care program, then they step in. Ensign, Barnett, and King did work on this, and all this literature on voluntary programs. What you're trying to do is collusion. We're trying to stop government from regulating, but we'll say, we'll do it, we'll take care of it. And lots of research has gone critically to look at this area. Then the next one, which we're in now, is this: we have threat of stakeholder action around the world when it comes to climate change and other issues, including income inequality and everything else that's coming up as well. and also threat from government action. And there you're managing for sustainability. In this case, what are we looking at? What can we expect? What kind of, this is where we need more research, okay? And here we're looking at strong pressure from both stakeholders and their constrained environment, and then now companies, and that's exactly the examples that in fact Mark gave, right? Yara, they're trying to co-create something. All these companies are trying to say, how can we co-create something? I don't think it's enough, but I could see what they're doing, right? That's where a lot of these bigger companies are dealing. So everyone designs, who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situation in preferred ones. Simon said March was also agreed on this. So where can we go from this? And there is a need to assess impact. The main question of impact evaluation is not being done in management literature, okay? We keep saying these firms are doing wonderful things. Are they? What is the social impact of their CSR? How do we measure that? How do we design it? How do we pilot it? We need to do more research on that area, because with that, then they can go ahead and say, look at what the wonderful things we do. And if it doesn't work, why didn't it work? Go back, experiment. Why do we not have entrepreneurs in this area? Why don't we have entrepreneurs within these organizations that look at this more closely? Ta-da! Next, but not least, last but not least, is this idea of business model. We need to better integrate sustainability into mainstream business model thinking. And this has led to alternatives, including triple bottom line business models, social business models, shared value business models, flourishing business models. There's a growing literature on closed loop and circular business models that break with the linear take, make, and dispose models. So this here is sort of an idea of this triangle of a special issue we have in business society. So you have sustainability and business model innovation, where you're looking at sustainability is increasingly seen as a driver for new business models. You also have sustainability in cross-sector collaborations. Here, you're really trying to look at, how does that work? What do we need? Who needs to be at the table? How do we co-create this? And then you have business model innovation, cross-sector collaboration, business models for sustainability cut across organization and sectoral. And so what remains underexplored is discussion on business model for sustainability, our collaborations and partnerships with our multiple stakeholders, suppliers, customers, universities, civil society. And that requires orchestration, right? That's a new term I want to see, orchestrating. And that's what Yara did, okay? The example that Mark gave, excuse me. And this co-creation, this orchestration, in some cases, the government who orchestrates it. In other cases, it may be a firm that orchestrates it. In other cases, maybe the NGO bringing people together. So we need to have more studies about how this orchestration takes place, how this scales up. And in some cases, it changes across time, and you may need government regulation at the beginning. And then it gets slowly, when things get normalized, gets reduced. But clearly, we need more research in this area. How is orchestration facilitating? How should this government help facilitate this type of orchestration? So I started with an Einstein quote. I'm going to end with an Einstein quote. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So I challenge everyone on this call to think about different ways of looking at different business models. And I think if we do that, it's going to be a way, and also not viewing governments as not being able to take risks. They do take risks, and they should be a partner in this, because we only have one planet and we need all of us to come together. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Irene. So, does it pay to be good? All right, the answer isn't yes or no, but it's wickedly complex, I think, as Irene's pointed out here. So now when you even go beyond theory and you have to actually put it into practice, it's going to get even messier. And that's what Auden's going to tell us about. Auden.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. And Mike, I did some slides in deference to you, but I'm not going to reference them that aggressively, but I will share them with you. So this picture, let me get to the
Auden, I don't know if there's anything with your proximity to the microphone or something, but you're pretty cracking up.
Yeah, I might need to go off video because my bandwidth isn't that great, so I may do that. Okay. Any better?
It's a little better. We'll see how it holds, and then I don't know if you can hear your own feedback. Probably not. So I'll let you know if it's too bad, and then you can decide about the video.
Okay. Okay. So so this is a picture of Aspen Highlands and a solar array, a 2.3 kW solar array that we installed. It was the first solar array in the ski industry. And when we installed it, we had customers come up to us saying, does that power your whole ski resort? Well, as you know, this is 2.3 kW. It barely powered a third of the building it was attached to. But the opportunity existed there for us to say, yeah, it powers the whole ski resort. How do you like that? And in reality, this is sort of what has happened in corporate sustainability in the world, is that businesses do things that don't really make a difference and nobody calls them out on it. An example of this would be the renewable energy certificate market of the last 20 years, the voluntary market, which I've written a lot about, where you buy essentially worthless certificates, and entities no less, renowned than the EPA say, that's good, you can call yourself 100% renewably powered. And then the media hasn't gut checked any of this stuff. And so the incentive for corporations just to do a little thing has been great because they never get called out on it. Recently, I was brought in to talk to a clothing manufacturer in the West, one of these kind of super groovy outdoor companies. And they said, tell us what we should do to be sustainable. And I said to them, look, carbon offsetting doesn't help you because, one, it doesn't really change sustainability or the climate. There's a lot of evidence that the offsets don't work. And it also doesn't give you market differentiation because everyone else is doing it. So I would strongly urge you to not do that. And I would urge you instead to use your very powerful and influential voice to drive policy change in the region and nationally. And after an hour of convincing presentation on my part, the CFO said, we understand what you're saying. We get what you're talking about. And we've decided we're going to buy carbon offsets. We're going to pursue a program called Climate Neutral. And by the way, we're probably not going to advocate ever. So there you go. The power opportunity was displaced. This is what Andy talks about, by an easy alternative that was uncontroversial. And so the question I've been asking, and recent news and current events kind of gets at this pretty perfectly. In the last week or so, there was the story of how H&M, the clothing manufacturer in China, basically made a statement about slave labor and Uyghur abuse in China, and was deleted on social media, and their websites were completely deleted in China. And the second this happened, the Sustainable Cotton Initiative and other corporations stood down. One corporation that's very well known, I was talking to last night, very quietly removed their statement on the Uyghurs in China from their website and hoped that nobody noticed. And in fact, nobody noticed. So it raises the interesting question, if genocide isn't enough of a social issue to get you concerned about sustainability, and if even when you intervene on genocide, you decide that it's too much of a business hit and you have to change your approach, is there anything that is going to cause business to move? More recently, or as we speak today, there's basically one opportunity, the final opportunity maybe in American governance to pass meaningful climate legislation. And you have organizations whose environmental statements are soaring and profound, Disney or Apple, whose environmental programs are run by an ex-head of the EPA, whose CEO is visionary and progressive. This is an organization that, along with many, many other corporations, are parts of Business Roundtable or other groups like the Chamber of Commerce that are actively opposing the budget reconciliation bill, the only shot we have at climate. So it's hard to argue that these corporations actually care about climate or sustainability. And so I'm starting to argue that we have to redefine what we're talking about. The term corporate sustainability that we've used for 30 years actually just means business management, because all the win-win things you would do as a business anyway. In fact, when I started here at Aspen Skiing Company, I talked to our ownership, a private family that owns a number of large industrial businesses. And I said, we're going to do sustainability throughout the enterprise. And someone told me, no, we're not, because all the things you're describing, they would do anyway if they're good managers. And we don't need you getting in the way. And the other kind of insight I've had is that corporate sustainability departments, if they were going to be effective, should be renamed government affairs. And asking corporate sustainability departments that are focused on operations to move the needle on policy, which is something I've asked for, is like trying to drive a nail with a crescent wrench. It's the wrong tool for the job. So I'm going to not take too much more of your time here, but I want to, point out that in Washington, the senators who are concerned about sustainability, like Sheldon Whitehouse, they really aren't seeing corporate intervention in ways that matter. And my concern, the real concern I think I'd bring up, here's Sheldon Whitehouse's quote, which isn't that in the media, but the concern I have is, so when Mark Kramer says, look, we need a metric that legitimately shows us who's reducing carbon most effectively and how that's going to go forward. What I ask is, okay, let's play that out on a timeline. Let's say we figured out the metric. Let's say we found who was doing it best and determined the best actions by corporations. By the time we figured that out, it would be too late to solve climate change. I mean, if we don't pass this reconciliation bill, and one way to pass it would be for corporations either to stand down or to aggressively lobby for it, it doesn't matter. So developing new metrics, figuring out better operations, it's all just a combination of rinky-dinking around the edges of the problem, or it delays us to a point where we'll never be able to solve these things. So I'm going to stop there because I'm really interested in the conversation more than my own talking here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we've heard now from all of the panelists, and so now we'll get into more of a Q&A. And I want to just start with giving Mark a chance to respond to the other presenters, since they've most directly addressed yours, and give a few minutes to respond and then to ask a question of any of the other panelists, and I'll do that same for each of the panelists.
Well, thanks, Mike. It may be disappointing, but I have to say I don't really disagree with my fellow panelists. While I think shared value is a legitimate competitive strategy, and that companies can indeed, and we see many examples of companies that that increase their profitability, their growth, et cetera, by taking an active role in solving social problems, innovating, et cetera. There is no doubt that industries are not shifting rapidly enough. I do think that most companies are operating on business models that were developed decades ago. Cases of banking, life insurance, others, it was centuries ago. And they were developed before we had any idea about climate change, about environmental impact, about any of the social determinants of health, any of the things that we now know very well today. But the challenge is that companies don't like to change, and there is tremendous short-term pressure on delivering shareholder value at any cost for the short term without much focus on the long term. And that has meant that companies, even if there is a better and more profitable business model out there, tend to stand by their old business model and resist change. And yes, lobbying has been deeply destructive to the progress we need to make. I'm on the board of the World Benchmarking Alliance, which was set up by the UN to track the progress of corporations toward the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. And as they're looking at 2,000 leading companies around the world, industry by industry, virtually none of them are on track. And hardly any of them have even made serious commitments to be on track. And of those that have made commitments, it's very hard to reconcile their social environmental commitments with their business plan projections. And so I agree that we need government regulation to stimulate much faster change at national and global levels. And I completely agree with Irene. For the complex problems, we need cross-sector coalitions that bring government and NGOs and companies together. And there's a body of work that I've been involved with my colleagues at FSG and John Kenya on collective impact, which really is a model for cross-sector collaboration. So it may sound odd, but while I do believe that companies can create shared value, should create shared value, that there is a lot of opportunity there, I also completely agree that large complex problems are only going to be solved by cross-sector initiatives. I absolutely agree with Auden that companies are taking shortcuts and thinking about sustainability as a matter of public relations rather than business substance. And I agree with Andrew that without government regulation pushing companies to change against their objections, we're not going to see the kind of change we need.
That's too easy. Is there anything that you disagree with anyone?
Well, the question is, how do we make the change that we recognize? So Auden very clearly identified the fact that companies are holding government back from making the changes that it needs to make. Ultimately, this comes down to political will. And we have a pretty dysfunctional political system at the moment. So where it leaves me is not that the four of us radically necessarily disagree, but I'm not sure any of the four of us have yet been able to put on the table a solution that is actually going to work and going to work on the time frame that we need.
Fair enough. Yeah, government, of course, brings a lot of baggage, and so it has its own share of issues that probably factor into trying to decide the optimality here. But I'll turn it over to Andy to respond to any of that and offer any other question.
Well, I'm sort of having an out-of-body experience here. I mean, I'm having my difficulty even collecting my thoughts. I agree. We mostly all agree. But what I find really confusing is that win-win ideas, and I have to say shared value ideas, get written up as if they're these revolutionary things that are going to, provide the next wave of growth for the economy and bring about these improvements to the social condition of the world, when it now seems to be they're just pretty much business as usual. So, and I know that sounds snarky. I don't want to be snarky, but I am finding it really disorienting because it does feel like we're just sort of, business needs to be involved. Business does good things. We need government regulation. but why have we had, all this, that idea doesn't seem like it's worthy of publication in the Harvard Business Review and all these places and all this advertising and all this name making. What's new? Anyway, that's me.
Okay, well, I guess it's only fair to give Mark a chance to respond to that.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that shared value is just business as usual. It does take a different mindset, and I identify with Auden because we've wrestled with companies that that just refuse to think about social environmental issues as business opportunities, as an issue of their business model rather than public relations and government lobbying. So it takes, and increasingly, I teach about companies that have really committed to a social purpose. And PayPal is one example, focused on democratizing access to financial services. Discovery Insurance, I've written about a lot, a life and health insurance company that has used behavioral economics to incentivize people to engage in healthier behaviors, and actually leads to fewer days of hospitalization, longer life expectancy, and so on, as documented by Johns Hopkins studies. It is a different way of doing business. It's not routine, it's not ordinary, and it is powerful. And but again, it's not sufficient. And there are all kinds of short-term counter incentives that I think drive business away from it. To me, much of the issue is the difference between a short-term and a long-term perspective on the part of managers. And there's just so much pressure to stay with the short term. So I don't think it's just business as usual. I do think it's an opportunity, but again, I don't think it's alone going to make the progress we need to make.
Yeah, I think there's still some confusion as to whether, it's a matter of companies not finding these opportunities, or that this whole structure is not amenable to how companies really operate. But Irene, do you have some additional thoughts?
I think there's a lack of leadership in organizations, and what Auden said, that there's these opportunities and I don't want to deal with, I'm going to take it off my website. There's so easy to take things off websites and change the communication, change the narrative. What happened in Texas with women's rights. I'm sorry, I'm going to go right there. The fact that, you have these companies promoting women's rights and all that stuff, and not saying a word about what happened, to me is a lack of courage, a lack of, and I don't know where that's coming from. And so we need to teach a better course on leadership and what it means to be a leader, to show guidance, anyway, don't get me started. But I want to hear from everyone else, so I'm going to stop now.
Yeah, there is some underlying oddity here in that, the market solution could work if the market actually demanded these things. But we are the market. We're also we the people for the government. So there's additional complexities there, but we don't, right? We want the cheap, convenient stuff too. And that's a whole additional thing to think about. But Auden, what are you thinking now after you know this?
To me, the interesting question is, if you take an organization like Apple, which really cares about its brand. I work at a ski resort, and I get attacked all the time for talking about sustainability at all, right? Like, who am I to talk? And yet Apple seems to not care at all that what it's doing is unbelievably hypocritical and destructive. So how could Lisa Jackson or Tim Cook live with themselves when they talk about social good, but do not pay taxes in the United States? And one of the questions Mark is right to ask is, hey, what is the solution here? And what I think is part of the solution is, how come there aren't big voices publicly shaming Apple? And another example would be Microsoft, which recently corporate tweeted sympathy for hurricane victims while opposing the reconciliation bill. And I think academia has a role. There was a question on the chat about what's the role of business schools. Academia can call that out. More powerful media can call this out. I would have to think, given the importance of brand in the modern kind of economy, that businesses can be shamed into acting. And it may sound wacky, but The problem we have is we don't have 10 years to reinvent business and capitalism and develop the right systems that'll really prove this out. We sort of have to move now. And the role of business can be to push back and call for things it cares about. And, my genocide example is in some ways bad because their business was completely shut down. But it's not clear to me that if Apple or Microsoft or Disney aggressively lobbied for climate action in the United States, that other than a tax rounding error, it would significantly hurt them. So I'm partially baffled why they wouldn't want to seize that brand opportunity.
All right, let's take a few questions from the audience then. It's Gary Cohen, can you unmute and ask?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Let me get on the camera. So first, I'm Gary Cohen. I'm Chief Revenue Officer of AeroFarms, which is an indoor vertical farming company. I was previously Executive Vice President of Global Health at BD, Becton Dickinson, and President of the BD Foundation. More importantly, I'm the founder of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. And I have a few comments. First, I think the conclusion that all the presenters were right to a point is where I came away, and it seems like the dialogue afterwards was similar. So I'm going to make a few comments, at least one of which I'm assuming all the presenters will agree that I'm wrong. But let me make the first one, and that is, I think you have to look at the underlying motives behind companies' behavior and their engagement, and not only the companies, but their leaders as well. And how is there some way of distinguishing whether a company and those that are championing a particular initiative or cause are sincere about their commitment to it? Or is it window dressing? Or is it a threat response? It's important to understand the motives. And I would agree that's not an easy thing to do, and it's subjective. But I would submit there's probably a minority, maybe a small minority of companies where the leadership truly are devoted to these types of causes, and where there's an intersection between how it affects the company and the role that the company can play in society. There's a greater probability of acting, meaning that if the issue itself is far removed from the company, there's a lower probability. I want to also mention on the role of cross-sector collaboration. One key question is, can any of these wicked problems or massive problems, or however we want to define them, can be solved by any one sector? Do they require, in fact, cross-sector collaboration to be resolved? And I'd like the term orchestration. Where will the orchestration come from? How will the interests and the actions of and funding of various parties be orchestrated towards a greater goal, so the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? And I'm going to share with you advice I once gave to a very well-known company when they approached me in one of my nonprofit leadership roles about an idea they had. I won't go into details here, but I recommended to them, don't come to me, go to your critics, go to the advocates, go to the activists who are criticizing you, find those that are open-minded and see if they agree with your approach. And if you can come to a meeting of the minds, then you're probably on the right track. I will tell you that particular company shut off all future communications with me as a result of that advice. And offline, I can share with you what the outcome of that was. Lastly, talking about regulation and policy, what I've learned as a practitioner, because for many decades I've been a practitioner of social innovation, was that it's in a company's interest, if they really want to get to an intervention to scale, to actively pursue policy change, whether it's regulation or guidelines or laws, because you can only get so far doing it strictly as a market initiative if it's a really big, difficult problem. And I can provide specific examples of that. Last point I want to make relative to genocide in China. I would make the point, Auden, that also not only companies, but almost all governments, nonprofits, NGOs, and universities have also been deferential to China and are careful about the positions they take. I would note that Ben & Jerry's is not boycotting China. Unilever is not boycotting China. They're choosing their battles. And unfortunately, human nature, including the nature of companies, is first and foremost threat adverse. And if anything, it may be admirable that companies were willing to take a position on China in the first place, given the potential threat to their business if they were doing business in China. And I'm not trying to justify it. I think all these players should be more outspoken about that issue.
All right, thank you, Gary. Just one phrase that comes to mind is, it's very hard to get a person to do one thing when their paycheck depends upon them doing the opposite. And we see that time and time again play out. But Let me turn it over to any of the panelists if you want to respond to any of what Gary said.
I would like to say something kind of at the end, or I can say it now.
Let's go for now.
I have to say I'm finding this whole conversation incredibly depressing. And it's incredibly depressing in my view because it shows the ongoing weakness of the left. The left somehow believes that this is about morality and leadership and hope, when that isn't what it's about at all. In fact, I think what happens on the left is we think we're well-intentioned, we care about the climate. If other people care about the climate, they'll worry about it too. This is not the way the world works. The left, because we think we're good people, that's what we want to do. And I don't know when it became that yeah, of course, business has to be involved in anything, that business is our friend, that business is somehow, the leadership of the future for tomorrow that's going to be somehow pro-social. When did that happen? And my fear is that that's exactly what's gone on. We've taken on this notion that the leadership and morality, and maybe it's win-win, whatever, shared value, whatever that is now, is going to somehow get us there. It isn't. And they're thinking that it is our problem. And yet all of our research says it isn't. What does all of our research say? It says firms use the hope in win-win to forestall action. What the heck are we doing? Are we not listening to ourselves?
Well, I can say that the Dror Etzion is out there trying to spur some sort of insurrection along these lines. So I'll see if you can unmute yourself and ask a question there, Dror.
Oh, I didn't have a question. I'm just trying to spark an insurrection, as you said.
All right, that makes it easy. We'll move it over to, how about Sarah? Sarah Dadouche, do you have a particular question you want to ask?
Thank you. This has been so great and provocative. I guess I would just reiterate the question that I raised in the chat, which is listening to Irene and also Mark talking about, it seems like the biggest potential for change is actually in corporate governance structures. Like if companies take seriously enough their social or environmental commitments, they will internalize those into how they run the company, design the business model, etc. Where beyond like internal desire to do good, can we get the push to get companies to make these kinds of changes? Does it make sense to do as I mean, I know it's a very long shot, but Elizabeth Warren proposed this Accountable Capitalism Act that would require all companies to include a social mission or a public benefit into their corporate charters, and creates the risk that those corporate charters could be withdrawn if the company fails to not just pursue that benefit, but actually causes harm. And that led me to another question of like, is regulation the answer? Do we need to change corporate governance by regulation? And relatedly, like, do we need to shift toward a more aggressive model of corporate accountability that maybe upgrades the language of shared value to shared responsibility?
I have, can I just say something? There was one gentleman who went to Davos, and he just floored everybody by saying, all we need is for companies to pay their fair share. And everyone was quiet, right? I mean, maybe we need to teach our accountants to actually work as accountants and not as someone trying to hide people's money. I mean, I don't know, but we need, if companies pay their fair share, and the 1%, whatever, then we wouldn't need as much of it, because then hopefully the money that was collected would be used to solve the social issues, right? That's government is supposed to help with social issues, social pressures and all this stuff. But if they're not, then we depend on all these things. We ask companies to give to the communities to feed the poor. Why should that be happening, right? So there's these cause and effect issues around here. And we've created this, oh, philanthropy is so important. Why do we need philanthropy? We wouldn't need it if people were paid properly, if they had housing, if government supported things, if people paid their taxes. Anyway, that's just me.
Yeah, absolutely fair enough.
I agree with that. I would just add, I think, the investor piece is a meaningful impact on companies. And part of it has to do, back to government, with whether there are true incentives for longer term investment that's not just a 1-year holding period, but 5-year or more. Part of it has to do with CEO compensation, where the CEO has a very short tenure. 90% of his compensation is in stock options. And so he's got, 2 or 3 years to pump up the stock price, and who cares what happens after that. But, I think the impact investing movement, which is very different from ESG investing. Impact investing, where investors are, making sophisticated investments in enterprises that have positive social and environmental impact while still trying to make a financial return, has grown to about $1 trillion. There's a lot of momentum for it. ESG is deeply confusing and misleading, and going into an ESG fund doesn't necessarily do much. But if we could get the investor motivation that is behind impact investing attached to more meaningful models of public company performance beyond this ESG mess, I think that would change company behavior. Just one thought to put out there.
Well, I know Ken Pucker has a lot to say on ESG and impact investing, so let's hear from him.
Thanks, Mike. I joined Auden as the practitioner here as well. I served as the CEO of Timberland, COO of Timberland for a long period of time, which was, I think, would be described as a creating shared value company. It did all kinds of wonderful things, not at my behest, but the behest of Jeff Swartz, who was the CEO, including doing community service at all sales meetings, supporting City Year with $1 million grant a year, 40 hours of paid community service, you name it, I could go on, but I won't bore you. And yet, at the same time, I will tell you that Timberland was a for-profit company that was traded on the New York Stock Exchange and did have Class B shares with 10-to-1 voting. So we were insulated from some of the investor pressure. But we had a total of 6 people when I left out of 6,000 that were focused on this agenda. 6 out of 6,000. Because the system pressures and incentives is what executives respond to. And so I don't believe that creating shared value will have or has had any profound effect on solving social problems. It doesn't mean a company shouldn't behave responsibly. It doesn't mean that there aren't win-wins. But creating shared value as a salvation or even a modicum of salvation to the social environmental problems which continue to grow, I think is a chase for fool's gold. I'll also add on, I just wrote a paper on ESG investing that was published in Institutional Investor, and Mike's right, I do have lots of thoughts about it. I agree with Mark that it's confused. But I would say that impact investing, I agree with Mark again, can have an impact. It's just very small. It's way less than 1% of invested capital globally. So again, it's not close to sufficient. And I think having a conversation about it being a lever for change is again the wrong place to focus. The right place to focus is on changing system rules.
So with that in mind of, kind of changing system rules and getting a different kind of framework in place, I mean, we're the educators and the practitioners, but a lot of us are educators here and the researchers, so a lot of it is on us. I want to turn it over to Gina Wertenberg and have her ask any questions she has about pedagogy, I guess.
Yeah, I had asked, and I heard one response about what do you see as the role of higher education, educating the next generation of business leaders around some of these changing system rules and reinventing the system and asking the right questions, as several of you talked about. I also want to briefly mention that in the next couple of weeks, the RICS is going to be publishing a new website, and we have blogs that will be, I'd love your response to on a lot of the stuff we talked about today, including our new 4-pillar model, which includes advocacy, activism, public policy as one of the critical 4 pillars. I have examples from many different companies like Mark Benion from Salesforce and some of the things that are going on with that, as well as aligning profit and purpose, engaging in responsible business practices, as well as giving back to society through corporate volunteerism, et cetera. So very germane to what we're talking about today, and I'd love all of your responses, and we'll make sure we send that to you.
I mean, I'll say very quickly, I think we've completely failed in terms of the moral aspects of education. I've found in bringing CEOs to my class, who are examples of shared value companies, that these CEOs have a very strong sense of purpose in their own lives and sense of social responsibility. And that's why the companies are on the path that they're on. And I've now added a dimension to my course that is asking students to reflect on their life purpose. And I think that, shared value is a choice. You can make money that way, or you can make money other ways. You can sell cigarettes. But I think that we need to be much clearer with students that there is a moral and ethical choice that is up to them to make. And we need to give them the guidance to help them make the right choice.
Auden,
It's an interesting question. You can have a pure moral character and live as a monster. Vinay Gupta's written about this. He calls the United States a monster factory because many of the decisions we make out of love for our families do harm in the world, and corporations are doing this too. I just want to get at, what are we supposed to do here? And I think over 25 years, I've got to the creeping conclusion that corporations aren't going to help us. They can't structurally. It would be nice if an Apple or a Salesforce could lobby, but if it's a long shot. And so for research and action, I think I look to people like Roger Hallam, who started Extinction Rebellion. There's a great article on him in Rolling Stone if you Google his name and Extinction Rebellion. He did research on how change happens in society. And he said, look, the only way it happens is through disruption. It happens in cities. It's peaceful, but you get arrested. And that drives change. And there are some examples of sort of revolution type social movements occurring a little bit, even in the business world. I think the example of the takeover of Exxon's board, 3-seat takeover, is getting there and certainly sending some level of message, if not enough. There's a guy who was head of Facebook and Google sustainability who's now mobilizing employees at tech companies to push them to advocate, specifically now on the reconciliation bill. So I think the research and the voice and the discussion needs to be more on what actually moves things in society, and how maybe corporations are part of that or not, but sustainability is more and more going to be about social movement than it is about praying that corporations help us out of this.
Yeah, that's a long-term solution too, and worry about the time frame on that. But a lot of the more near-term stuff is going to depend upon what goes in which column on the balance sheet. So I want to see if Paulo Quattrone still has a question, as he's our resident accountant here.
I was going to ask, thank you, Mike, first of all, how many people are accountants in this room, virtual room? Possibly, I don't know, I'm curious, because there's been talk, someone, I think it was Sarah, who said we need to change corporate governance rules, and I agree entirely, but we need to change accounting rules and practices as well. If we account for profit, we will only see profit. I shared, and sorry if I did a bit of self-advertisement, an article where if we move the format of the income statement from one that measures profit to one that measures value added, and how this value added is distributed to different stakeholders, including nature, we would already make a step towards a solution. And by the way, that solution, for instance, in some countries like Italy, was the solution until 1980, before the financialization of the world took place. So the solution is there. We have just forgotten that it exists.
Well, as I had suggested from the start, time is going to fly by, and it has. Do any of the panelists want to make any final statements? Not even Andy? No? Okay. So let me just wrap up. Then we'll close the recording.
I just
And
want
if-
to say I just want to say one thing. I love skiing. I'm an avid skier. And climate change is affecting the ski hills. They're like the canary and it's unbelievable. So I'm just saying that, Auden, I mean, I wish you all the best, because I think your industry is going to be very much affected.
Irene, the epiphany I had recently, I used to think skiing was going away because it was going to snow less. And now I think we're just going to burn down.
Mhm.
That's my latest
Yeah.
insight.
Oh, that's a happy note. Yeah, so I'm going to wrap it up. There's still a lot of people that have a lot of questions, I'm sure. I don't know if any of the panelists can still stick around. If you can, we'll end the recording, then we can be even more blunt and continue on for as long as you're willing to stick around. But for now, we'll close it out. So first, let me just start with a sincere thanks to our panelists for what was a very great debate. So thank you. And many thanks to all of you for participating. The materials from today's session will be posted on the RICSI website, which is at business.rutgers.edu/RICSI. Please note that I've set up a Twitter account to use for refinements of any research questions. The Twitter handle is @research_better, and the title is Better Management Research Questions. And please join us for the next QUASI seminar on October 15th, when we'll debate the question, is luck better than strategy in cultivating corporate innovation? That session will feature Cheng-Wei Liu, Melissa Schilling, Christian Busch, and Michael Malbosen. Hope to see you there. Thank you all very much. All right, so with that in mind, Deb, you want to kill